The door opened too fast, and the cold rushed in before I understood what was happening. Snow spiraling under the porch light, while my father's voice sliced through the air, sharp and final. "Get out." He wasn't looking at me. He was pointing at my 8-year-old daughter. Ava was still holding the paper angel she had made at school, cheeks pink from the cold, boots leaving careful prints on the welcome mat. "Grandpa, I made this for—" She didn't finish. My father stepped forward, grabbed the edge of her coat, and shoved her backward into the snow. The white swallowed her small frame for a second before she scrambled upright, confused more than hurt. Christmas lights blinked behind him like nothing was wrong. Inside the dining room, relatives stood frozen with plates in hand, watching through the open doorway. My mother didn't move. My sister crossed her arms. "Don't ever come back," my father said again, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. My name is Lillian Moore. I'm 33 years old, divorced, and for the last 6 years I've been the disappointment in my father's house, the daughter who left her marriage, the daughter who moved back to town, the daughter who asked too many questions about the family contracting business. We had arrived at Christmas dinner with a homemade pie and neatly wrapped gifts. I had called earlier that week to confirm it was okay. He said yes. He always said yes until there was an audience. I didn't argue when he shoved my daughter. I didn't scream. I walked forward, lifted Ava out of the snow, brushed ice from her hair, and wrapped my coat around her shoulders. My sister muttered, "We're better off without you," and my mother added quietly, "You brought this on yourself." I looked at my father one last time and said, calm enough to unsettle him, "Then you won't have a problem with what I'm about to do." He laughed. He thought humiliation would silence me. He didn't know my phone had been recording since he said, "You'll regret exposing me," in the kitchen 15 minutes earlier. He didn't know that 2 days before Christmas, I had already met with a forensic accountant. He didn't know the folder in my car contained bank transfers tied to his business account and my sister's personal deposits. He thought throwing us into the snow ended something. He didn't realize it started everything. The drive away from that house felt longer than usual, even though it was only 12 minutes. Ava sat quietly in the back seat, holding the paper angel in her lap, staring at the blinking lights fading in the rearview mirror. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked softly. That question landed harder than the shove. I pulled over at the first empty stretch of road and turned to face her. "No," I said firmly. "You did nothing wrong." I meant it. The truth was, she had done nothing but exist in a room where control mattered more than kindness. By the time we reached my apartment, I had already decided I would not let this become another story that ended in silence. I tucked Ava into bed, checked that the recording was saved, and opened the folder I had prepared weeks earlier. For months, I had noticed discrepancies in my father's company accounts, vendor payments that didn't align, equipment purchases that never appeared on job sites, transfers labeled consulting fees that landed in my sister's account. When I asked about them, I was told I was dramatic. When I pressed harder, I was told to mind my own life, so I did something else instead. I documented. The forensic accountant confirmed what I suspected: misappropriated funds, falsified expense claims, and internal transfers designed to look legitimate. The night before Christmas Eve, I emailed the licensing board, attaching the documentation and the audio recording. The subject line was simple: formal complaint and supporting evidence. I didn't CC my father. I didn't threaten him. I let the system do what systems are designed to do when given facts. 5 minutes after pressing send, my phone rang. It was my father. "What did you just do?" he demanded. I let him speak until he ran out of volume. Then I said evenly, I told the truth. The line went silent. For the first time in years, he had nothing prepared. Christmas morning came without invitation. Ava and I opened gifts in our small living room, the heater humming softly while snow continued to fall outside. There was no grand table, no extended family, no blinking porch lights. There was peace. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't my father. It was his business partner. "The board is asking questions," he said quietly. Did you really file a report? Yes, I replied. Then this is bigger than a family argument, he said. He was right. By evening, the licensing board had acknowledged receipt and initiated a preliminary review. My father called again, his voice no longer booming but strained. You're ruining everything, he said. I stood at the window, watching Ava build a snowman on the sidewalk below. You ruined it when you pushed her, I answered calmly. The next morning, investigators requested additional documents. I provided them. Within 72 hours, the company accounts were frozen pending audit. My sister called screaming, accusing me of betrayal. You destroyed Christmas, she said. No, I replied. You did. The audit moved faster than my father expected. Years of small discrepancies, quietly hidden under vague expense codes, surfaced under scrutiny. Vendors came forward. Former employees confirmed inconsistencies. My father tried to frame it as accounting error, but the paper trail didn't bend. It held. 3 weeks later, the company's operating license was suspended pending formal hearing. The same man who opened his door and told my 8-year-old to get out now stood in a courtroom answering questions about structured fraud. I wasn't vindictive. I was present. I sat quietly in the back row with my daughter beside me, listening to the language shift from pride to procedure. When the judge issued temporary restrictions and financial oversight requirements, my father looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not because he was weak, because control had been removed. After the hearing, he approached us slowly. You didn't have to do this, he said. Yes, I answered. I did. There are moments when you either shrink or stand. I had spent 6 years shrinking. Christmas night ended that. Over the following months, my father entered mandatory financial review. My sister moved out of the house she once bragged about. My mother stopped defending the narrative and started confronting it. None of it was dramatic. It was administrative. That was the point. I didn't scream. I didn't retaliate publicly. I let documentation replace humiliation. 1 year later, on Christmas Eve, Ava and I drove past my parents' old house. The porch lights were off. A for sale sign stood quietly in the yard. Ava looked at me and said, Are we going there? I shook my head gently. No, I said. We're going home. And this time, home meant a place built on clarity, not control. My father once believed power came from volume. He learned it comes from accountability. He believed silence meant submission. He learned silence can mean preparation. He believed pushing us into the snow would end something. Instead, it exposed everything. I never wanted revenge. I wanted safety. I wanted stability. I wanted my daughter to grow up, knowing that being thrown out is not the same as being unwanted. And once you choose not to shrink, once you choose to document instead of react, once you choose to stand calmly while someone else collapses under their own choices, something irreversible happens. The narrative shifts. The room changes. The door may close, but the truth remains standing outside it, steady and undeniable. That Christmas night didn't break me. It clarified me. And clarity, once earned, does not disappear. The next morning didn't feel like Christmas anymore. It felt like aftermath. I woke up before dawn, not because I wanted to, but because silence has a way of amplifying everything unresolved. Ava was still asleep, her small hand curled around the paper angel she refused to let go of, as if letting go would mean admitting something permanent had shifted. I stood in the kitchen staring at my phone, waiting for the first call, because men like my father do not sit comfortably in consequences. It came at 6:12 a.m. His voice was not loud this time. It was controlled, deliberate. You need to fix this, he said. No greeting, no acknowledgement of what happened the night before. I didn't respond immediately. I let the weight of the words hang. Fix what? I asked evenly. He exhaled sharply. The complaint. The board is already asking questions. I imagined him pacing the kitchen, rubbing his jaw, trying to reclaim the narrative. They're reviewing documentation, I said calmly. That's what they're supposed to do. He lowered his voice further. You've made a mistake. I almost smiled. No, I replied. I corrected one. The line went silent for several seconds before he said something that told me everything I needed to know. You're going to regret humiliating me. That word again, humiliate, as if accountability were cruelty. I ended the call without raising my voice. By 9 o'clock, the ripple had started. My aunt texted asking if everything was okay. My cousin sent a message saying he'd heard something about the business being audited. The licensing board had moved quickly, faster than my father expected. Temporary freeze on new contracts, formal request for expense clarification, mandatory review of transfers over the past 2 years. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't need to. The point was never destruction. It was exposure. Around noon, my sister called. She didn't scream this time. She sounded tired. You could have talked to us, she said. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the spreadsheet still open on my laptop. I did, I answered quietly. For months. Silence. Then softer. Dad says you're overreacting. I let that sit for a moment before responding. Did you know about the transfers? I asked. Her pause was longer than comfortable. I knew he moved money sometimes, she admitted. I didn't think it was serious. Serious. That word does a lot of work when people want to minimize impact. It was serious enough to push my daughter into the snow when I wouldn't stay quiet. I replied. She didn't argue with that. By afternoon, 2 representatives from the state licensing board arrived at my parents' house. I wasn't there, but my mother called me immediately after. Her voice shook, but not from anger, from fear. They're asking for statements, she whispered. They're asking about your recording. I could hear my father in the background, pacing. Answer honestly, I said calmly. That's all you have to do. She didn't respond to that. Instead, she said something unexpected. He's scared. For the first time in years, I felt something other than anger rise inside me. Fear doesn't excuse behavior, but it explains it. My father had built his identity around being the stable one, the provider, the man whose voice controlled the room. Documentation removes volume. It removes intimidation. It replaces it with structure. And structure does not bend for ego. That evening, I drove to their house alone, not to confront, not to argue, to witness. The driveway was empty except for my father's truck. The Christmas lights were still strung across the porch railing, blinking as if the previous night had never happened. I knocked once and let myself in when no one answered. He was at the kitchen table, the same seat he occupied when he told my daughter to leave. The folder I had assembled lay open in front of him. Vendor invoices, transfer summaries, email confirmations. You've put us in a corner, he said without looking up. I stepped closer. You put yourselves there, I replied evenly. He finally lifted his eyes to mine. They weren't furious. They were calculating. What do you want? He asked. There it was. Not an apology, not reflection, negotiation. I didn't hesitate. Acknowledgement, I said, and separation. His brow furrowed. Separation? I nodded once. I removed myself from every informal role. No more silent stabilization. No more cleaning up. No more assuming I'll absorb the fallout. He leaned back slowly. You'd abandon your own family? I held his gaze. I'm not abandoning. I'm disengaging. The difference mattered. He understood that. He tried a different angle. The business will survive this, he said. It always has. I glanced at the stack of audit requests on the table. It will survive if it's clean, I replied. Not if it's hidden. He stared at me for a long time. You think you're stronger than me? He said quietly. I shook my head. No, I think I learned something you never did. He waited. Silence isn't weakness, I continued. It's leverage. The following week, the board suspended his contracting license pending compliance review. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't front-page news. It was procedural. That's what frightened him most. There was no argument to win, no person to intimidate, just paperwork. My mother called me again, this time not to defend him, but to ask for guidance. What do we do? She asked. I didn't sugarcoat it. You cooperate, I said. Fully, she sighed. He thought he could fix it before anyone noticed. I almost laughed. He thought I wouldn't notice, I replied. 2 days later, my father showed up at my apartment. No raised voice. No accusation. He stood in my doorway like a man who finally understood that authority doesn't survive without credibility. I was wrong, he said. The words were quiet, controlled, measured, but real. I didn't respond immediately. I let him sit with it. You were, I said gently. He nodded. I thought you'd protect us, he added. There it was. The expectation. The assumption that my stability existed to reinforce his. I protected the truth. I answered. Over the next month, compliance corrections were made. Unauthorized transfers were repaid. Vendor contracts were restructured. My sister moved out of the house quietly. My mother stopped defending behavior she could no longer justify. The investigation didn't end in prison sentences or dramatic collapses. It ended in restructuring, in oversight, in accountability clauses my father would now have to live under. That was more lasting than punishment. The hardest part wasn't watching the business unravel. It was watching my father adjust to a world where his word wasn't final. One evening, he called and asked if I would review the remediation agreement before he signed it. Not because I was obligated, because I was qualified. That distinction mattered. I reviewed it carefully, corrected 3 clauses, and sent it back. He signed it without argument. Christmas decorations came down early that year. The house looked stripped without the lights. Ava asked once if we would ever go back there for holidays. I told her the truth. Only if it's safe. Safety isn't about walls. It's about boundaries. Months later, the business operated under tighter regulation. My father attended mandatory ethics seminars. My sister found work independent of the company. My mother began volunteering in the church again. But this time, she didn't speak about sacrifice. She spoke about accountability. The shift wasn't loud. It was structural. One evening, my father stood in my doorway again and said something simple. You didn't destroy us. I waited. You corrected us. That was the first time he used that word. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just nodded, because this was never about revenge. It was about stopping the cycle. And once a cycle is broken, it doesn't resume quietly, ever. By the time spring arrived, the legal noise had quieted, but the emotional recalibration had only just begun. Investigations move in phases. And once the headlines fade, what remains is structure. The licensing board had imposed mandatory financial oversight on my father's company, which meant quarterly reporting, third-party audits, and compliance training he once mocked as bureaucratic overreach. For the first time in his professional life, he had to answer questions he couldn't dismiss with volume. He didn't say it out loud, but I could see it in the way he held himself when we met for coffee 3 months after Christmas. He no longer leaned back in his chair like he owned the room. He leaned forward, listening. That was new. The man who once told my 8-year-old to get out of his house was now asking me to explain amortization, schedules, and compliance, disclosures without interrupting. I didn't savor it. I observed it, because correction without humility is just temporary restraint, and I needed to see whether this was transformation or adaptation. Meanwhile, Ava had stopped asking about that night. Children process differently. She didn't replay the shove. She remembered the cold. She remembered how her paper angel got wet in the snow. She remembered how I wrapped my coat around her shoulders without shouting. That detail mattered more than any courtroom summary. One afternoon she asked, "Is Grandpa still mad?" I told her something simple. Sometimes people are mad when they realize they're wrong. She nodded as if that made sense. In many ways it did. The business review uncovered more than I had initially documented. Not criminally catastrophic, but enough negligence to explain years of quiet instability, vendor favoritism, cash flow juggling, delayed tax payments disguised as administrative backlog. It wasn't villainy. It was arrogance. My father had believed he could outrun accountability because he always had. But documentation doesn't chase. It waits. When the board recommended restructuring rather than revocation, I wasn't surprised. Small-town businesses rarely implode if there's willingness to comply. What surprised me was my father's response. He didn't fight it. He didn't frame it as persecution. He accepted it. That acceptance didn't erase what happened on Christmas, but it shifted its trajectory. One evening, months after the shove, he asked if he could speak with Ava directly. I hesitated, not because I wanted to deny reconciliation, but because reconciliation without safety is just repetition disguised as forgiveness. I agreed under one condition. I would be present. He sat on the edge of my couch, hands clasped, and told her he was sorry. Not for being strict, not for discipline, for pushing her, specifically, directly. Ava listened quietly. Children recognize tone before content. When she nodded, it wasn't absolution. It was acknowledgement. That was enough. I began rebuilding more than the condo. I rebuilt systems. I removed myself formally from all informal family financial structures. I terminated shared account access. I rewrote my will again, this time adding a clause that required third-party trusteeship should any future disputes arise. Not because I expected a recurrence, but because I no longer tolerated ambiguity. Ambiguity had allowed too much. Some relatives quietly labeled me cold. I didn't correct them. Cold implies absence of emotion. What I felt was measured. There's a difference. Brooke visited more often during that period. She had distanced herself from the business once oversight began, perhaps realizing that inherited privilege carries inherited liability. One afternoon, she admitted something she hadn't before. "I always thought you overreacted," she said. "Now I think you just reacted first." That was progress. Not dramatic, not tearful, just honest. Our relationship shifted from competition to conversation. That shift mattered more than public perception. 6 months after the fire, I was invited to consult on a regional hospice compliance framework because of how I handled my own crisis. Word travels quietly in professional circles when someone responds to trauma with structure instead of chaos. I stood in front of a room of administrators and explained how personal boundary enforcement translates into institutional stability. I didn't reference my father. I didn't reference Christmas. I spoke about documentation as a protective architecture. Afterward, a hospital director approached me and said, "You turned something destructive into a case study." I thought about that. Sentence later that night. Destruction doesn't have to end in ashes. It can end in design. The house my parents sold never became a symbol of loss. It became a symbol of recalibration. They moved into a smaller property closer to town. My mother stopped volunteering for performative roles and began handling administrative tasks quietly. My father stopped speaking in absolutes and started asking questions. Those shifts weren't visible on social media. They were visible in posture, in tone, in pauses before speaking. When we gathered the following Thanksgiving, no one joked about disappointment. No one mentioned the business unless asked directly. My seat wasn't just present, it was unquestioned. That mattered, not because I needed validation, but because silence no longer meant suppression. It meant stability. One evening, almost a year after the fire, my father stood beside me in my rebuilt kitchen and said, "You didn't raise your voice once." I looked at him carefully. I didn't need to. He nodded. I always thought strength meant dominance. I waited. "It doesn't," he added quietly. That admission was worth more than any apology, because it meant he had understood something beyond surface correction. Strength is containment. It's restraint. It's precision. The investigation file eventually closed. No further penalties. Compliance achieved. Restitution paid. The public memory faded, as it always does, but the private architecture remained. Ava still keeps that paper angel in her desk drawer, not as trauma, but as proof. Proof that being pushed doesn't mean staying down. Proof that calm can redirect chaos. Proof that truth doesn't need amplification if it's documented. People occasionally ask whether I regret escalating the situation. They assume escalation means volume. It didn't. It meant paper. It meant process. It meant refusing to let harm become habit. If I had stayed silent, the pattern would have repeated. Maybe not with gasoline, maybe with money, maybe with something smaller but equally corrosive. Patterns don't stop without interruption. The night my father opened that door and told my daughter to leave, he believed he was asserting control. What he actually did was remove illusion. Illusion that authority shields behavior, illusion that family prevents consequence. Illusion that silence equals loyalty. Once illusion burns, what remains is structure, and structure, when rebuilt deliberately, is stronger than whatever stood before it. I don't tell this story for sympathy. I tell it because correction is quieter than revenge, but more permanent. I didn't win. I stabilized. I didn't shout. I documented. I didn't destroy my family. I forced it to operate within truth. And truth, once enforced calmly, does not negotiate backward, ever. The final shift did not happen in a courtroom, and it did not happen in my rebuilt kitchen. It happened quietly on a Tuesday afternoon, when I received a call from the licensing board confirming that the company had officially completed its probationary oversight period and would continue operating under permanent compliance reporting. It was procedural, clinical, uneventful, and that was the point. Stability isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It settles. It hardens. It becomes infrastructure. When I hung up the phone, I didn't feel victory. I felt completion. The fire had taken walls and furniture and familiarity, but had also burned away something subtler, my instinct to absorb damage for the sake of peace. For years, I had believed that being the steady one meant swallowing chaos quietly. What I learned instead was that steady does not mean silent. Steady means structured. It means measured. It means knowing exactly when to step forward and when to let consequences speak. My father came by that evening without calling first, something he had not done since the court proceedings ended. He stood in the doorway of my condo, hands in his jacket pockets, looking around like a man examining something he once underestimated. "It feels different in here," he said. "It is," I replied. He nodded slowly, then sat down at the small dining table where Ava was doing her homework. She looked up at him cautiously, then returned to her pencil strokes. Children recalibrate faster than adults. They don't need grand apologies. They need consistency. "I wanted to tell you something," he began, voice lower than usual. "When this started, I thought you were trying to destroy me. I didn't interrupt. Now I understand you were trying to stop me." That sentence held weight, not because it absolved him, because it acknowledged the pivot. I leaned back slightly. "I was trying to stop the pattern," I said calmly. He nodded. "I see that." We sat in silence for a moment. Not tense, not reconciled, but aligned. Alignment is quieter than forgiveness and more durable. Marla called a week later, not frantic, not defensive. She had completed her probation requirements and was preparing to apply for a new job out of state. "I don't blame you anymore," she said softly. "I blame myself." I didn't respond immediately. Accountability sounds different when it's genuine. "Blame isn't the point," I said. "Change is." She exhaled slowly. "I've been thinking about that night," she continued. "You didn't yell?" I smiled faintly. "Yelling wouldn't have helped." She paused. "You were always stronger than I thought." That sentence mirrored my father's earlier admission. Strength in their vocabulary used to mean endurance. Now it meant boundaries. That distinction was the real repair. My mother began attending financial literacy workshops at the community center. At first I thought it was performative. Then I realized she was taking notes. Real notes. She stopped saying, "Your father handles that." She started saying, "We're learning." It wasn't flashy. It wasn't public, but it was movement. At a family barbecue months later, a neighbor casually joked about how chaotic family businesses can be. My father didn't laugh it off. He said evenly, "We had to fix some things." No defensiveness. No blame shifting. Just ownership. That was new. And because it was new, it mattered. The following Christmas arrived without spectacle. No dramatic announcements. No tests. Ava insisted on bringing a new paper ornament she made for the tree. My father opened the door slower this time. He crouched to her level before saying anything. "You're welcome here," he said quietly. She nodded, not fully trusting, but not afraid. Trust rebuilds slowly. It requires repetition. That night, we ate dinner without raised voices. No one mentioned the previous year. No one needed to. The absence of hostility was enough evidence of change. In the months that followed, I was invited to consult on a regional crisis response framework for nonprofit organizations. Apparently, my case study had circulated among administrators who saw value in procedural calm during personal crisis. I spoke about documentation as defense, about how emotional manipulation often hides behind urgency and shame, about how boundaries are not aggression, but architecture. After one session, a woman approached me and said, "I've been carrying my family's financial instability for years." I thought that was love. I told her what I learned the hard way. Love without accountability becomes erosion. The condo feels entirely mine now, not because the walls are reinforced or the wiring is new, but because the narrative inside it belongs to me. There are no borrowed keys, no quiet transfers, no unspoken debts. My accounts are clean. My will is precise. My emergency contacts are chosen deliberately. Some might call that cold. I call it clear. The fire was intentional. The correction was deliberate. The outcome was permanent. I didn't lose my family. I lost illusion. An illusion is often heavier than reality. One evening, nearly 2 years after the fire, my father stood beside me on the balcony watching the sunset reflect off the city skyline. "You changed everything," he said. I shook my head gently. "No," I replied. "I stopped pretending." He considered that for a long moment. "I wish I'd understood earlier," he added. I didn't respond with regret. I responded with fact. "You understand now." That was enough. The lesson wasn't that revenge feels good. It doesn't. It feels heavy. It feels necessary. It feels like replacing something cracked with something load-bearing. The real victory wasn't in court or in public opinion. It was in the recalibration of roles. I am not the absorber. I am not the silent stabilizer. I am not the daughter who smooths chaos without acknowledgement. I am the person who documents, who sets terms, who refuses to let harm repeat quietly. And if there's one thing the fire taught me, it's this. Destruction clarifies structure. When something burns, you see what was holding it up. When you rebuild, you choose what remains. I chose accountability. I chose boundaries. I chose calm. And calm, once established, does not collapse easily. They lit the match believing I would fold. I followed the paper trail instead. And paper outlives flame. Always.